It is Thursday, rawmike.richards.com, broadcasting live from the DKI studios in downtown Toronto. Got Scotty Morrison in today, brand new book. Oh, yes. 100 years, 100 moments. I wonder if the Detroit-Calgary Flames game makes it into that book. Maybe it's a late entry into one of those 100 moments. Probably not. That was old-time hockey. The kind of hockey that a lot of people say that people don't like. Dave, did you enjoy that moment last night?
Yeah, it was okay.
Yeah.
I don't mind that from time to time.
Of course you did.
Kind of grew up watching that almost on a nightly basis.
Yeah, and there's probably a couple of games you probably played in that looked a little bit like that.
Very similar to that. A little different in the Manitoba Junior Leagues, where some of the players actually used foil, which is kind of out of Slapshot, not out of the NHL. But I'm glad those days are gone.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I guess exactly what happens, but I think when you're chucked for fighting and you go off into the tunnel and you come back, there will be a definitive answer in the rule book, Dave, about how many games that would be. Because it will be games. If you think it's not going to be games, you're going to be wrong. So we'll talk about that. We've got Victor Newman's passionate picks. Also, it is Throwback Thursday. If you're fans of Boardwalk Empire and the two guys on this show, huge fans.
Big time.
Especially Richard Harrow, who had the mask on, the half face, because his other half of his face was blown off in World War I. That was the story. He had a very unique way of talking, and he sort of lived on the edge. And guess what? We loved him.
And he was into sports, too. He was into sports, too, when it comes to his talk show.
Well, his talk show was very underrated.
Can we, is this, I don't want to spoil anything, but is this when Richard talks to John Farrell by any chance?
There's a sentence that only on rawmike.richards.com would you hear what David Bastel just said. On the John Harrow show, was that the one with John Farrell? Yes, it was.
Okay, because that was my favorite.
Yeah.
Like when Carson comes out with his greatest and he puts it on DVD, or when whoever, just name it. For Richard Harrow, John Farrell might be at the top of his list for his talk show.
Similar to the Carson throwing the tomahawk of the picture with the guy and hit him in the nuts. That's what this is for us. That's the equivalent on this show. Now, there weren't any tomahawks thrown at guys' privates last night in Calgary. Not that probably hasn't happened before either. I think in the Electric Avenue days, I think a lot when they gave away, hey, drinks for 50 cents. Those days. Wasn't like that, but it looked like that last night. And, Dave, when you look at how hockey's played these days, the one thing I would say, I get how people never liked the designated fight guy. Like, the designated fight, to me, never really made a whole bunch of sense. And growing up playing hockey, depending on your age group, let's say in the 80s, late 70s, 80s for me, you fought when you got mad. Or, it wasn't really that strategic. It just was a game where, you're wired as hockey players, and once it got to a certain point, Dave, you stick me or you do whatever, you run my goalie, whatever happens to be, the gloves come off, and that's how it was dealt with. Sometimes, depending on how sophisticated your team was, you might have had a tougher guy. That tougher guy, in the day, protects the superstar. Like, there was just sort of levels of how the game worked unofficially, if you want to put it that way. A lot of people refer to it as the code or a code, and it doesn't really have a huge implication in modern day hockey as they are trying to eliminate for a couple of reasons. Number one, lawsuits right now in any professional sport that has contact will be almost the death of the sport itself. And look, there's a couple that are borderline. Even though we flock to see a hockey game, how many people south of the border want to see a football game. But when you look at how the rules have changed over the years, they flirt with some real serious damage, not only because of, the actual combat and the contact nature of the sport, but those that play that want to turn around and sue the leagues for hundreds of millions of dollars. So that has brought us to this day and age of, I would say, contact sports. You can also throw in what they say combat sports.
Yes.
And there is a huge protection issue. So they're trying to get rid of what is the cheaper stuff, or deemed to be cheaper. So at this very moment, fighting still exists in hockey. Different levels of hockey have different rules and implications should you be in a fight. But what the NHL has done is sort of weed out beyond the fight should other shenanigans happen. For instance, like a guy starting a fight, Dave, or being in a fight, he gets chucked, he goes into the tunnel. If he comes back, that's probably going to be a really clear-cut and not that difficult a decision, I don't think, for the NHL in this matter. I wouldn't think.
No, it is. It's by the rule. It's basically you pull out the papers and you go bang. 10 games, that's what it's going to be. So we'll see. We'll probably hear a lot more about that a little bit later on this afternoon when the NHL actually addresses it. It should be pretty clear cut as well. It won't be one of these, let's debate about this for the next 3 days or whatever the case is. But and no disrespect intended here, but the players that were involved that are getting the major games, they're not exactly significant players.
You're not paying to see Luke Butowski play.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Sorry to the Butowski family. I'm sure they're lovely.
Yeah, so it's
maybe not.
It's one of those scenarios where they're not debating whether or not to pull a Johnny Gaudreau out of the Flames lineup for 10 games these days. Mike is 3 weeks. That's a good chunk. Like this guy, when they actually lay down the penalty, he'll be back just before Christmas, and then Christmas break happens. So it's like, wow, that's a pretty significant penalty.
Well, so we'll find out what happens with respect to, I guess the penalty that's going to come down. Although I don't think anyone's necessarily holding their breath. As I said, even if you're a Detroit Red Wing fan, this is not going to be that upsetting. I would also say that in the world of upset, those that have, problems with this scenario, Austin Matthews.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so here we are. We're based out of Toronto, so that means if we listen to anything Toronto-wise, I'm saying even on the news, like they've got news broadcasters who really don't know who Austin Matthews is.
No.
They might say Austin Delaney. Like, I just don't know at times. And that'd be difficult, too, if Austin Delaney, who I like. But they're sitting there going, will Austin play or not play? And more on this. Here's someone who makes $20 an hour who's going to tell you all about it. Well, thanks, Jade. Looking into their phone, it's just garbage. Anyway.
News reporters that do sports stories are the worst people on earth.
Dave, do I need to see this on the news tomorrow? Let's go down to Mike Richards, and he's standing by the MasterCard Center. It's like, well, apparently Matthew Austin is Austin Matthews is. Back to you, Kim. It's shit. It's just shit.
It totally is. And you know what? Big thumbs up for all those stations out there cutting sports jobs. Don't cut away from the news stuff, or heaven forbid you play the weather every 5 minutes because we can't turn on a single channel and actually find out what the weather is in about 1.3 seconds. Cut out the sports jobs because nobody likes sports, do they?
Yeah. The weather people. Seriously? All right, I'll give you that. Some cloud looks clear so far, Dave.
Bingo.
I'm a meteorologist. No, you're not. I know guys who've been called meteorologists. Hey, one of them in the radio business, who I won't name, his main business was, what was it again? Oh, yeah, growing weed amongst his Christmas trees. This was the meteorologist. It's a joke. Back to the sports now. Austin Matthews. Do we think he's going to play or not play?
No, I don't think he's going to play.
Yeah.
Roast beef, I know you want to chime in about this one.
The Russ cam is just ready to go. You were bursting.
He's like, no, he's going to play.
Russell, come on.
I don't think he's playing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't play tonight, but I haven't heard anything either way.
Like when you call him and don't leave a message and stuff, was it him that picked up? Was there breathing? Like did you feel that you got any information from that call?
No. didn't. No answer,
Who's this
no
number?
response.
Who's this number who keeps calling me? Don't you know I'm playing with my fidget spinner? Well, you know, and looking at the Leafs, the one thing that I is it should we be and that is in the media or certainly here in the GTA, is it that obsessive over Austin Matthews? We know what he brings to the team, you know the level of play that he has. But is it really sort of akin or parallel to Aaron Rodgers being knocked out? Because that's pretty shallow of a team if that's it.
Yeah, not to the same extent. Because
I don't think it is.
Because this Maple Leafs team without Austin Matthews is still a pretty good team. I don't know. I don't know if it's a playoff team, to tell you the honest truth. I think it's probably borderline playoff team because they still have some young stars on the roster. But what Austin Matthews does is make up for a lot of different mistakes and a lot of offense and makes everybody around him a heck of a lot better. So you take that piece out of the lineup and they go from division contender to wild card contender. I think that's maybe the best way of saying it. Now, Aaron Rodgers leaves the Green Bay Packers.
Your season's over.
And the season's over, and you have not ensured that position by bringing in a veteran. You have relied on somebody you hope to God never ever saw the field, and guess what? He's seeing the field for the rest of the year.
That's where hockey's a little bit different. I mean, than other sports. In football, you see what happens. Your stud quarterback goes down. Your season's over. LeBron James gets hurt. That season is over.
Absolutely.
In hockey, even if you lose your star guy, so who's the biggest star right now? Well, you could argue Steven Stamkos. But if Stamkos goes down, how many games they lose because of it? And Kucherov has had a spectacular season. It's not that it doesn't hurt your team, but I'll go back to when a bunch of years ago when Chicago got knocked out early. But I think Duncan Keith was out. There was a couple of guys like real substance, and there's like 2 or 3 of them. And the adage is that you can't blame getting knocked out of the playoffs or not making the playoffs or your season on injuries. So I go, well, yeah, it depends on who the injury is. Just ask the Green Bay Packers. I don't think that's true. I think you lose your star in a given sport, and if the sport is okay, so Major League Baseball, Clayton Kershaw gets knocked out. I think you start taking out 20 wins out of a lineup plus. Yep. That's in a short series. Maybe you get knocked out because you don't have that guy even in a best of 7. Maybe so you don't see him twice. Yeah. I think that it is reasonable to say that a star, the significant star, does change your season.
Well, yeah, and in the case of the Dodgers, it's almost like not starting Clayton Kershaw in a game 7, and you kind of see what happens. Oh, geez, that did happen, didn't it? Okay.
The Darvish family now.
Yep.
Darvish family line 1.
Bad example.
Oh, there you. He'll good the baseball player. No, he's not. Mrs. Darvish or Mr. Darvish? No, he's not. We all saw it. Twice, by the way, Darvish family, twice.
Bingo. And shame on the Dodgers.
I still don't get that part. I don't get it.
You have arguably the greatest pitcher of a generation, and you're keeping him in the bullpen.
Like Dave, there's no game 8.
It's like so stupid.
There's no game 8.
I don't get it. It's right up there with the stupidity. Actually, it exceeds the stupidity. It exceeds the stupidity of when Buck Showalter decided to keep Zach Britton out of the game against the Blue Jays in a 1-game elimination.
Yeah.
There's no Tuesday if you don't win on Monday. And
it's the first thing I thought of when that happened, actually. Yep. The exact same circumstance.
It's like
of good managers who had good baseball teams.
Yes.
Guys who have been in the baseball world since they were 6.
Yeah. And in Buck Showalter's case, if he was there for 6, that would have been 103 years. He's been in baseball for 103 years.
Very strange. I'll never understand that. You're watching rawmikeRichards.com, either on our website or, of course, the dedicated YouTube channel. We like when you subscribe to it. So if you're watching right now and you haven't done so, just click the little red banner. As I'm speaking, it's right there.
Yeah,
click on that, and you're part of the group.
That's right.
And trust me,
beside the DKI.
Yeah, right beside
logo.
DKI. Absolutely. So just hit that, because eventually we'll have giveaways. And how do we give them away? You got to be part of the group to win.
That's right. When we form a gang.
Yeah.
And you're part of that gang.
Yeah.
Only gang members get jean jackets with back patches on the back.
That's right.
Nobody else.
Correctamundo. All righty then. Hey, Throwback Thursday. I know people have brought that in. And,
yes.
And
very popular on social media, now very popular here.
Yes, we've not really done it like this, but Boardwalk Empire was like a fantastic show.
It
HBO, Mark Wahlberg was a part of it. Was Scorsese? I'm trying to think of all the names.
I think he
there.
was.
Yeah,
I think he was. Yep.
It was just ridiculous.
You got it, Nookie.
That show was so awesome. It featured a character named
Richard Harrow.
Richard Harrow, who had half of his face removed because he was a World War I veteran, and it also affected his voice.
It did.
So he wore a mask over the part of the face that was blown away. He also had a little bit of an edge. If you wanted someone to be eliminated, you called Richard. He had a selection of different kinds of guns, and if you were a bad person, generally, that's what he got.
Yep.
The bad guys, he was the earlier version of Dexter.
Yep. Just not as slick.
Not as slick, and no kill room. The kill room was where you were sitting. That's how it worked. But I was so surprised when it turned out they actually had a talk show late at night. And his first guess, well, you just won't believe, it actually was in the baseball world.
Live from Atlantic City, it's the Richard Harrow Show. Tonight's special guest, John Farrell. And now, here's Richard Harrow.
Tonight's first guest is the new manager of the Boston Red Sox, John Farrell. John, it's so nice to have you here.
Well, it's great to be on the show. It's my first time.
Is the Red Sox job your dream job?
It is. It is.
Blue Jays just got a lot of good players that you didn't have.
Well, that is true, and I wish them certainly all the luck.
Don't you want to blow their heads off?
No.
I would. I'd take a shotgun. That'd make them pay.
Oh, not me. It's the Richard Harrow Show, Friday nights on CTV.
That
was pretty solid.
That was a great show.
I
missed that show.
I'm kind of curious why that show didn't last as long as I thought it was going to last.
It cost a fortune. Like that was like a movie.
Did it? Okay.
They ran its course.
So maybe that was the reason, because these days those shows don't have longevity. So.
Well, I mean, what, 7 seasons, 8 seasons,
Sure.
and you're kind of gone.
Yep.
But you know what was crazy? In that last year, they go back in time and they recast everyone to look like sort of the characters that were playing at that time. So Steve Buscemi.
Yes.
Do you remember how good that
It was awesome.
Where do you find another human being that looks like Steve Buscemi? Because that's sometimes not a good thing. The casting director comes out, your agent says, "Hey, Dave, what are you doing?" Well, they're looking for another guy who looks like Steve Buscemi.
Yeah.
You're like, "Excuse me?"
Not me. Not me. Please, not me.
It pays $1 million.
Oh, me.
Exactly.
Did I ever tell? Okay, speaking of stand-ins, did I ever tell you when they did the Sheldon Kennedy movie? It was a CTV movie. They were looking for stand-ins for the Sheldon Kennedy picture, like the actor.
Yeah.
I'm almost the exact same height, weight, and size of Sheldon Kennedy when he played in the NHL.
Right.
So I was up for the audition. So I went in there and I do this, and this, and now I'm not playing the character. I'm just the stand-in. So basically, when the actor isn't doing his lines and all that kind of stuff, I basically sit there and they shoot lights from where they're gonna, it's coming from this way. Okay, move to your left, and then they do all the markings, and then so they cut the first 2 guys. They went on to the next one. Then they come to me and they said, you're much better looking than Sheldon Kennedy.
Yeah,
you can't be Sheldon Kennedy. And I'm like, well, I take that as a compliment, but I really want this job, because it was a 50-day shoot. So I would have been on set for 50 days, and you know how much money that possibly could be for 50 days. And yeah, it wasn't the case.
I know Sheldon. We should call him and say, by the way, Dave Bastel turned down the role simply because he
I didn't turn it down. They turned me down.
Okay, well, Sheldon's awesome too. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is an author, amongst other things,
Hall of Famer, actually.
And a Hall of Fame in writing.
That's right.
And broadcasting? Does he get that too?
Broadcasting, yeah. It was the Elmer Ferguson Award. I think it was 2006. Yeah.
Our guests get everything. We get nothing.
Oh, I know.
What is... Just once. I'd like to win a clock radio or something. Can you give me something? So what we're going to do, and again, talking about the book, 100 Years, 100 Moments, of which you'd have to be pretty careful to pick those moments, and you got to know that this is the kind of book that people will read and immediately start family fights, arguments.
That wasn't number one. This was number one.
Which is so great. So we're going to play something. I don't know if it's one of the 100 moments. It depends on the city you live in. It depends on the age group you are. But if you remember this particular moment, then you have lived for 100 years. It's the 1967 Stanley Cup Parade in Toronto. All of a sudden, it's 1967. They lost the sound.
Is that what happened?
Well,
I like that marching band, though. You got the drums and everything.
Well, see, these days you don't really hear I mean, this is how long ago it's been. The main sound in that parade was clip clop, clip clop. That's how long it's been since the Maple Leafs have won a Stanley Cup. The book is called 100 Years, 100 Moments. Our good friend Scotty Morrison in today. Scotty, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Now,
Great to see you both.
You've got a little story about this.
Well, it's interesting as you talk about how long ago it was, 50 years, obviously.
Yep.
And back then, when you look at the video, there's not a ton of people on the street.
No, I noticed
because, they won, I think it was 4 cups in 6 years through the 60s. They were a powerhouse back then.
Eh?
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
People took it for granted. And I actually did a piece for our Sportsnet regional Leaf games. I've been doing these 100 years of Leaf memories, and when you've got 50 dry years, it's really hard finding video that isn't all black and white. But I did the story to kick off the season that, once upon a time it was ho-hum. They took it for granted that cups just came coming, and you think about 1967 nobody had any clue what was ahead.
Yeah, well, and you know what? That's the other thing too. When you start talking to those that are 40 and younger, and you start talking about those kinds of issues, I couldn't imagine. Like, I mean, I've been around for the Blue Jays World Series, and you can't compare a CFL championship anymore to what that is on the world, sort of the international stage. If the Toronto Maple Leafs were ever to win a Grey Cup, and now it's almost semi-feasible, it's or Stanley Cup rather.
It may be a Grey Cup first.
Yeah, it could be a Grey Cup. Hey, there was a day when I think guys played on both teams. And
they did.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
Did once upon a time.
I can't imagine what a Stanley Cup would look like in Toronto in this era. How crazy this would be. I don't know.
And you think back to those Blue Jay World Series and what the city was like immediately after the games, never mind parades or anything like that. It was just like Yonge Street, and from the foot of Yonge Street to as far up as you could go was just wall-to-wall people out celebrating and enjoying the moment. So it's
I guess it would look like
it's
the Cubs.
Beyond imagination what it would be here if they won the Cup.
Would it look like the Chicago Cubs, what that city went through? Would it be similar to
Pretty much,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the drought isn't as long as their drought was or the Boston Red Sox were. But 50 years is a long time and counting. So, this place would be just a madhouse. Absolute madhouse.
So before we were in here talking, the three of us, Mike and I, were going back and forth and talking about 100 years, 100 moments. And the number one thing that came to our mind is how the heck did you actually break it down that this is 1, 2, 3, up to 10? Never mind 100. I mean, was there a panel? Was there debates? Is this all Scott Morrison's stuff? Is this your opinion? How does it break down for anybody looking at this? Because I'm guessing, Scott, that, you know, considering we have social media and people go, oh, that was at number 3, this was number 3, that was at number 1. Clearly, this happened. How can you explain and describe the top 100? Because I'm guessing in 100 years, you probably could have come up with 500 moments.
Oh, easily. Excuse me. Clearly, it wasn't scientific, but it was fun. And, you know, I put our head together with some of the folks at the National Hockey League, because obviously they were prepping for their 100-year celebration and the coverage that they were going to provide. And all their researchers were going through and putting together lists, and then it was just a matter of trying to put them in some kind of order so that you didn't want it to be chronological, but you wanted moments that were impactful, and then, you know, after a while, it's up for debate. So
Sure.
hopefully that's what people can have fun with.
Absolutely.
Well, sport is there's an emotional attachment to it. So therefore, there is bias, because depending on the time frame, where you were in life at that time, the significance of that moment to the rest of society, what would be a big moment maybe in some years or generations would not be in others. So I think, for the most part, as an author, that you probably, I think some of those things in your mind, there must have been some gut sort of recall of for you saying, okay, for me, this was this. Maybe there's a smattering of them. Were there, how many do you think, just more or less in your mind, you think, okay, I have at least 10 to me that are in the top 100. They don't even have to be the top 10, but some must have resonated with you emotionally.
Well, yeah, I mean, because you lived through them. Mm-hmm. There might have been moments I covered over the years.
Exactly.
Things like the Gretzky trade, for instance. And one of the things you looked at is that, what was the impact of a moment? So it may not have been the greatest moment in hockey, but it was an impactful moment. So you think of, in the top 10, we had the Stastnys defecting.
Yes.
Back in the day, it was just a couple of, ultimately 3 guys eventually arrived, but nobody could have seen what impact that was going to have on the game. You look at rosters today, it's all because they started it, that door opened, and then eventually, of course, the Iron Curtain fell, and a lot of players came through it. The Gretzky trade, the impact that that's had on not just hockey in California, which we're starting to see the results of that in recent drafts of, you know, Austin Matthews in Toronto.
Exactly.
Obviously came through Scottsdale, was where he was, but the impact of that deal on building minor hockey in the United States and that sort of thing. So, and then you get down to just magical moments of, you know, Gretzky goals, Gordie Howe gets 1,000 first to 1,000 points, things like that. So the Richard riots, on and on it goes. So not all of them were game-changing, but they were magical moments in their own way.
Sure.
That affected the game.
Now, this is NHL only, correct? This is National Hockey League only?
We
or is
kept
this
this to NHL. Yeah.
Because the most debated thing that I think in doing this for the last probably 27, 30 years is the Paul Henderson goal. Because there are some, and our good friend Liam McGuire, of course, has been real close to Paul all those years. It has issues to do with the Hall of Fame. Like, it's a different argument. It's not this book. But because if you
should be in.
But
in my estimation.
But yeah, I want to hear that, because sometimes it was one of the staunch guys against it, ironically, I think was Harry Sinden, who said that he should never be in the Hockey Hall of Fame. I thought, okay, considering what that tie is historically, I find that to be almost incredible that he would say that.
Well, I always say the guy who gave up the goal is in. So the guy who scored it should probably be in there, too.
Good point.
I think there'd be a lot of people on that side, Scotty, absolutely.
And, I mean, Tretiak was obviously a brilliant player. But, again, it was a different time where, you know, those Russian teams were playing against a lot of quote-unquote amateur teams. And so, anyway, I think he should be in there just because of what that moment meant to hockey. And obviously that whole series was a game changer, for sure. So I think Paul should be there. But, yeah, I mean, once you drift past, that wasn't an NHL moment. It was a moment with NHL players.
Right.
But it was outside of the history of the league and all of that sort of thing.
You mentioned the Stastny brothers, Peter, Anton, Marion. Is there anything in this book about, I guess, in a sense, the Russian invasion, where the Russians finally come over? And because there was a time, even when I was following hockey, that you'd almost think to yourself, well, we'll see the Russians every couple of years at the Olympics or at a world championship or something of that, but never did we think that there would be maybe 1 or 2 Russians per team in every single team.
Yeah, there is a chapter, the Russian Five, which was number 16 on our hit list there, again, because of how that became such a game changer with, you don't think twice about guys on rosters now or where they're from. You know, it doesn't matter. They're just hockey players.
Planet
and you
Earth.
hope that they're good hockey players if you're a fan of the team. So, but yeah, when the Russian Five, the KLM line, and all of that again, and you think back to some of the stories you hear of Canada Cups and Gretzky sneaking guys over to his father's house to give them a beer when they're being followed.
Well, tell
by
that
the
story for people who don't know that story. Tell that story. It's fantastic.
Great story.
I'm trying to think which Canada Cup it was, whether it was 87 or 84, but the players, even though they were such intense rivals, at the end of the day, they're still players. They're hockey players, and hockey players like to commiserate and whatnot. And there was a fascination with the Soviets, obviously, because it was a different lifestyle back then and a different world and that part. It was us versus them, which was the real intrigue to that 72 series. That was political.
Yeah.
It wasn't just hockey. And you talk to those players, and it was a war. You hate to misuse that word,
but that's how it's been described many times.
It was us versus them, our system versus their system, our beliefs versus their beliefs. So anyway, as it turned out that Gretzky, and I want to say it was Larionov and a few of the other players that he ended up, and they were closely guarded when they were over visiting, but he managed to bring them over to his father's house in Brantford and to show them the museum that exists there. And well, he did. They smuggled them down to the basement and give them a few beers to let them relax.
Isn't that? I've never heard that story. I didn't know that story.
Did you do the document, the story on that on Sportsnet? I remember seeing Ron McLean headed up, or it may have been one of those hometown hockeys. I'm trying to remember.
Might have been hometown from Brantford that they told the story.
Yeah. But that story is out there. And it's really cool.
Well, again, the significance of that time. So I'm 9 years old watching this, and all I knew was that, and I'm using this word, I hated them. I hated the Russians. I knew that I thought in my mind they were supposed to be robotic, so they weren't really human to me. They were unfair, which makes no sense at all. Like, it really doesn't. that somehow there was a cheating element to it.
And they were communist, and communism was a fearful word for us back in that day. You were afraid of them. It was a superpower, and when you think of the politics of the day, that there was that feeling that they were a bit of a loose cannon, for lack of a better word. But anyway, when you talk to the players, it was very much a feeling of it was our way of life versus their way of life, how we play the game versus them. And what was beautiful when it was all said and done after that 72 series is that we learned from each other. And there was a huge respect level of, boy, those guys can play. We can play too.
Sure.
The things that we learned from that series that we took in the way that we train, nutrition, like all those things that we did not do in 1972. I mean, you're coming to camp to get into shape.
Yeah.
If your players here in Ontario are going up to Muskoka or maybe the Okanagan, if you're in the western part of the world, you'd have the beers and the steaks and everything else, and then you burn the fat off in like September. That was the thinking. There are 10-year-old kids who were on similar regimens, right or wrong, that probably followed very strictly what we learned from the Russians, like implementing other sports and just workout techniques and the core of the body, the whole thing. It changed the world of hockey for the better because I'll be honest, Scott, I think the world has never played better hockey almost equally across this planet than what we see right now, which is why the Olympics, when they're played with all the best players available, is the best hockey tournament in the world, and I think it's been fantastic. And it started with Vancouver, and I'm thinking, you don't see a lot of the 10-0 games anymore. Players simply played at a high level all around the world, and I think hockey's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of nations have caught up. Once upon a time, it was Canada and Russia, and then everybody else was kind of at that next level, or there's a handful of, the Czechs were very good, but they always seemed to be at the next level. The Americans brought their game up. But yeah, there's a lot of countries playing at similar levels now, and
I don't think it's 50% anymore. I think we've dipped under 50% in terms of producing professional hockey players.
right.
I don't think Canadians are 50 anymore. Just under. Still the number one country, obviously, in the world, but I don't think it's 50.
No, there's a lot of countries have caught up. So, and that's a great thing.
Yes.
Yes and no.
Oh.
One of those 50% that's not in there, then it's a little dicey. But no, it's a good thing on the bigger stage that's happened. It'd be interesting to see if we ever make our way back to the Olympics. I've got a huge. I'm really looking forward to these Olympics. Having said that, just because the intrigue of having a team we're not going to go in as the favorite necessarily. And just to see what we can do, because I grew up back in the day when we had the quote-unquote our amateur teams that tried to knock off the big bad Russians. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, it really will be.
A lot of speculation about whether or not the Russians are going to be at these Olympics as well because of all that doping stuff that's been going on.
That's very true. I wanted to talk to you about something with you, Scott, on a personal level, because it's kind of topical with the Hall of Fame ceremonies on Monday. You were part of those ceremonies back in 2006, the winner of the Elmer Ferguson Award, and just a fantastic honor. And you know, it happened a while ago, but it's probably something you never forget as from a personal standpoint. What do you remember about that night and having to speak and getting presented with this award and you know, one of a handful of journalists and media people that have, you know, gotten that honor?
Well, I think the first thing you remember is that you get a phone call, and at the time it was from the late Jim Kelly, who worked for the Buffalo News, and he was president of the Writers Association at that time. And I guess we were out at the Stanley Cup final in Edmonton, and I got the phone call that I was getting the nod, and then it's just like all of a sudden it's just very surreal. Like,
Yeah.
you say, how did this happen? Because and you know, you hear players say it, and you know, winning the Elmer Ferguson or winning a Foster Hewitt Award, you don't go into the business thinking, well, I got to win awards. You go in because it's something you enjoy doing. You know, some days it's work, most days it's just a lot of fun. And so when you ultimately do get acknowledged, it's very, very special. And to be acknowledged by your peers, I guess, is
Absolutely.
that they have that measure of respect that really resonates with you. And then once you get closer to that weekend, it's just like, oh my, this is really cool. And it's funny because I spent some time in recent weeks with Paul Correa and Timu Solani leading up to their induction, and it was like they were on pins and needles leading up to. More so, Paul. Timu's, you know, just is such a free spirit, but Paul's a perfectionist. It's like, oh my God, this has got to be great, and it was great. His speech was marvelous, but you start worrying about, what do I say? I don't want to forget anybody.
That's right.
When you're saying thank yous.
And it's a long list.
And
of
it's a
people,
long
you
list.
know, it's like, oh, where do we go?
Yeah, but the weekend itself is absolutely magical, and they give you that blazer. It's actually a full suit, but
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
and it's
I
Hugo
didn't know that.
and it's Hugo Boss.
Hugo
so,
Boss, there you go.
Okay.
So once a year I get to wear it, put the jacket on, put the blazer on, and go to the. We have a fabulous luncheon in the afternoon. The hall really does it right.
Yes.
It's a fabulous ceremony for both the writers and the broadcasters at the luncheon in the afternoon, and then of course, you know, everybody sees what the evening looks like, and it's a tremendous party, and it's nice. So as I say, one day a year I upgrade my wardrobe by putting on the Hugo with a nice crest on it.
We're in conversation, Scott Morrison here on rawmike.richards.com, also watching on the website and the dedicated YouTube channel. You know, getting back to that book, so I'm just curious, in that process, as you get closer, do you start at one, I assume, like, what is the process, one and down or the other way around?
It was just knocking them off as they came along. You know, you just keep saying, come on, get to 100.
Because I think it might bounce around where you think you have the number one, and then through process, maybe it gets moved. Did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing was coming up with as close to 100 stories. Yeah. And that's what it is. So we didn't want to get into, because, you know, over the course of time, the 75-year anniversary, and there's been other books that just have come out that's sort of been that chronological history, and we didn't want to become a history book in that sense. So it was coming up with 100 stories that makes it a little different kind of book and a different read when you get right down to it. So, you know, pictures and stories. And so it was coming up with those 100 ideas to start, and then start knocking them off. And as we got closer, working with the publisher, with the editor, Craig Payette was my editor on this project, and talking with some of the the historians with the NHL, then it was kind of finessing. Well, where do we think this should go and that should go, and then moving it around, and then finally at the end I said, "You guys do what you want to do. I'm done." No, it was a lot of fun that way, and you relive the history and a lot of magical moments, and then you realize, boy, there's a lot of them I had the great pleasure to be a part of too, which is pretty spectacular. Yeah. One of my favorite stories is, I've written it a couple times now, and obviously there's a lot of Gretzky in here, and one of them we talked about the great goodbye, and Gretzky, his final game and everything else, and it's interesting because I shared the story in here, and he reminded me of it, and is I did a book with Hockey Night called My Greatest Day, and so I'd phoned Wayne and I said, I want to do a chapter, obviously, on you for My Greatest Day. I said, you've had a few.
Yeah, 100.
One or two. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about, answer the question. Fill in the blank, my greatest day in hockey is. And so a couple weeks later we got together, and he just, as only Wayne can, just totally blew me away with what his greatest day in hockey is and was. And he talked about, you win Stanley Cups, fabulous moments. Sure. You win Canada Cups, fabulous moments. You score a game-winning goal, fabulous moments. And he said, so there's just so many of those great moments. But he said, in many ways, when he looked back on it, he said, almost my greatest day was my last game.
Really?
And he said, the reason was, he says, I got up that morning, my mom and dad were staying, obviously he was in New York at the time, he says, my mom and dad were staying with me, and he says, I got in the car that morning with my dad, and we drove to the rink together.
Oh, wow.
And he says, it was like I was 8 years old all over again, and my dad was telling me, you got to do this, you got to do that. He's trying to talk me out of retirement, first of all, he says, which is a bit of pressure, and Walter's saying, don't do it, come back for one more year. But he said, it just brought the whole thing full circle, that I was a kid again, going to the rink with my dad, and it was just like, oh my, a lot of memories.
Yeah. Well, you get in your career to have met really almost every outstanding hockey player that has ever existed. I mean, you're not going all the way back. We're saying, and just so you know, I'm not saying, 100 years. So what was that like 100 years ago?
I wasn't at the first game.
I'm not saying, but
I missed that one.
When you think of the almost the royalty, we had Murray Howe on last week talking about his dad, who was a working man. Like he worked for a living, and he never stopped at any aspect of life working. I mean, to the last time that we saw him, which was just before it probably got the dementia probably took over. But of the individuals that you have met, and we've always said this, the greatest ones that have played the game, there's a real humility about these Canadian guys that achieve these upper atmospheric reputations. And is it because they're Canadian? Is it because of these, the Brantfords or the Brandons or the, it doesn't matter where they seem to come from. Is there something to that? Why our guys are like that? Why?
I don't know. Maybe it is part of being a Canadian. We tend not to be, I don't know, is it boastful? Is that the right word? Or we tend to be a little more humble, it seems, about ourselves. But I think of a Gretzky, I think of a Jean Beliveau, I think of a Gordie Howe, and boy, you can just keep going on and on down the list. And gentlemen, they never stop being gentlemen, and it's like they never forget their roots, where they came from, who got them there, and their feet are always on the ground for some reason. And I just think about the alumni events I go to. I think Hall of Fame night, the number of guys you see that come back, and they're still so down to earth. And I was at the NHL Alumni Gala a few weeks ago doing interviews, and just every guy that came in was a gentleman, and couldn't give you enough time to share stories, and they wanted to share the stories and live some of the highlights of their career, but all just really, really good people. And you think like a Beliveau, one of the stories that comes to mind, you think back of him was, there's a classic story that he was in he was in a variety store one day, and a lady come up to him and said, "Geez, I think I know you," and she mistook him for a Montreal Alouette, I think it was at the time, but he didn't correct her, and he shook her hand and said, "Thanks for saying hello," and then let her go on her way, thinking that she'd met her football hero instead of her hockey hero. But then stuff that, and he would pass this on to the kids that. He said, whenever he signed an autograph, he made sure you could read his name because
so true.
Kids,
so true.
You take that time because people deserve to be able to see what your name is and things like that. And there's so many guys that and Gordie Howe was so similar, and on and on and on it goes. And it's not just that generation; it's moved on to generations past that I got to know over the years. That I saw Brian Trottier the other day. You just couldn't ask for a finer human being. And give you his time and thoughts, and just, as I say, on and on it goes. So we're blessed, that's for sure.
I think so. I think so. I think you're right.
Outside, and we're in downtown Toronto right now with everybody watching us from wherever they're watching us from. Outside of the Stanley Cups for the Toronto Maple Leafs, what are some of the greatest moments? Or are there some of the greatest moments in this book with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and what would they be outside of the Stanley Cups? Or is it all about the Stanley Cups for the Toronto Maple Leafs, considering the historic value of the team?
Yeah, by and large, Stanley Cups. I mean, you've got Bobby Bond scoring a game overtime winning goal on a broken leg, going home, refusing. That was in a game 6 against Detroit that year. Going home between games, refusing to see the team doctor, absolutely avoiding him, icing his leg so he could play game 7 on a broken leg one more time.
Unreal.
So it's stories like that. You've got the 42 Leafs who were down 3-0, and that again against Detroit in Stanley Cup final, come back, first team to be able to come back and win 4 straight to win a Stanley Cup. So that they would be some of the bigger Leaf moments, but mostly cup centric.
Right. When you and again, because it's such a large scale when you talk about 100 years, but in that time, I think of and again, it seems like when someone says they don't like a player or I hate that guy, I always find it to be strange. It's not like they came to your house, and when you weren't home,
you hate him because he inflicted pain on your team. Well, that's the reason.
So there's a lot of Sidney Crosby hate, and yet. I look at this young guy and how he's handled himself, and he's one of my favorite guys. It's not like I have posters on the wall of him or anything, but I'm just saying when it comes to Canada, when it comes to Olympic teams, when it comes to watching how he holds himself as that player on that team that has been so good, he's one of the top guys for me.
Yeah, I don't know why people complain about him.
But they do.
He got a bit of a reputation, it seemed, earlier in his career that he might have complained a little too much.
Yeah, the crybaby.
People
or Crosbaby. Isn't anybody that Sidney Crosbaby?
To that, but
a lot of Flyer fans out there, right?
All he's done is win.
Yeah.
Stanley Cups, Olympic gold medals, on and on it goes. And the thing that I appreciate about him is that, and you think back to some, Olympics especially, and Stanley Cup, he's the hardest working superstar I've ever seen in terms of actually getting in and mucking. There's been a lot of great superstars who worked hard, scored big goals. They weren't out there floating, but this is a guy who's not afraid to get his hands dirty, as they say, and play behind that goal line and come out with the puck, not just be the guy that finishes it off. So I don't know. I'd learn to love him in a hurry if I was a hockey fan.
No, absolutely. So you've been with the Toronto Sun, CBC, Sportsnet, just to name a few. Out of the Stanley Cups.
My old building right across
I was going to say. I still say the Sun building. People, what are you talking about?
A place a couple doors down that we spent a few hours in too, but that's another story.
Well, why do you think we picked here, Scotty?
Do you have a favorite Stanley Cup final that you covered as a reporter? Because you've done countless Stanley Cups, but do you have a particular one that you were like, yeah, you know what, I'd put that on my Mount Rushmore?
Boy, you get the Stanley Cup, they're typically all good, and they are.
Sure.
There was a few years where you get some of the sweeps, and but it's funny because a lot of times by the time you get to the final, everybody just wants it to end anyway.
Yeah,
it's been a long grind. Let's get this over with and bring on the summer.
That Vancouver was a Vancouver
Boston was pretty magical.
Really,
and I happened to be. I was working with Hockey Night at the time, and myself and Jeff Merrick, they put us on a desk that was outside the CBC building, which is right next door to the Rogers place, I guess it's
Yep.
called.
Yep.
So it was right in the midst of all the fans, and all of a sudden they come to us to do a hit, and all we hear is this poof, and we took a look, and that's when the car exploded in behind
Oh,
us.
God.
Oh, jeez.
And then we're sitting there, and a police officer comes up, and I'm sitting at this end of the desk, and he comes up and he's grabbing my arm. He says, "Get inside, get inside." I said, "Well, we're back on the air in 20 seconds." And he says, "No, you're not. Get inside."
Wow.
And the producer could hear him through my mic, and he said, "Get inside. We'll figure it out."
Yeah.
And about 20 seconds later, after we got inside the building, is the riot cops with the big
Yeah.
the cannons and everything came around the corner.
Shields,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh my God, that was quite not a great hockey
No,
experience.
no,
that one,
no.
but a different kind of series, and it was such a lopsided home and away series until that 7th game.
Well, whether it's the fans or what happens on the ice, I mean, whether we want to admit it or not, I mean, violence is a big part of that culture of what we have grown up with. As I said, whether it's rioting in the street or I think in the Stanley Cup playoffs as a kid watching Boris Salming's face get cut up the way it did because that series.
I was at that game.
That series was literally, for some people, nauseating because it was the ice was covered in blood every single game. Roy McMurtry wanted to press charges. That still stays with me even as a kid looking at that because Boris Salming to me, and we talked about the changes historically in the game. So my uncle Guy, so Gunnar Kinnear, is as we go up to his place in Midland because that's where Harold had his boat.
Yeah.
And this is one of Guy's jobs is looking after Harold's boat. And he had mentioned or mumbled one time about you won't believe what's coming over here this fall. And they're not from here. So we thought, well, it can't be Russians. Harold could never have a Russian on that team at that time. And, of course, here comes Inga Hammerstrom and Boris Salming. To me,
1973.
that was a huge, huge moment.
It was, and there was actually 5 players arrived new to the Leafs that year. They had 3 first-round draft picks: McDonald, Turnbull, and Neely.
Not bad.
And then Salming, and then they signed Salming and Hammerstrom. So they turned it around in a big
Quickie,
time hurry.
yeah.
You know, you still had Sittler and all the rest of it. And Boria, one of the greatest athletes I've ever seen. I mean,
Jim McKinney said he was afraid. Like
Yeah.
literally,
he could do anything.
he could stay up all night, which he would.
Yeah.
Then come in, have practice, and still soaking from the night before of everything else. He'd say, "Hey, does anyone want to go play tennis?" McKinney's,
Yeah.
what are you nuts?
Well, he never golfed, and they said they took him out at the annual golf tournament, and he just picked it up and was lights out. And as much as that reputation was back there in the day of the chicken Swede, he was not a chicken Swede.
No.
And trying to think who the player was now. I think it might have been Kurt Walker. Anyway, the Leafs had imported a couple tough guys because Philadelphia with the Broad Street Bullies back in the 70s, and everybody was taking liberties with Boria, though he never backed down.
No.
And they brought in this one fighter to kind of offer up a little protection and balance. And I guess one day after practice, he was trying to teach Boria some pugilistic skills, and Boria put him down. It was like, where did that come from? And it was just like everything he did very well. And he had, you talked about back then that training camp was 3 weeks to get in shape, but this is a guy who is in shape year-round, well before anybody had figured that out. His body fat levels were ridiculously low. It was just a brilliant player, brilliant athlete. Yeah, and a game changer too.
Absolutely.
Now you've been a reporter, broadcaster, everything else. Is it fair for me to ask you, do you have a favorite Maple Leaf, like at a personal level? Just considering that you've seen so many different Leaf teams, good and bad, great coaches, not so great coaches, staff. You've met a lot of different people in this Leaf organization. Is there somebody that kind of sticks out for you that this is my favorite guy?
Well, in various times. I mean, back when I was a kid, Keon.
Oh, Keon. I knew because Keon was mine. Number 14. Everyone
Keon
had 14.
And Frank Mahovlich were
Sure.
guys you really enjoyed watching. And then to be able to get to know them over the years.
Sure.
And, when Dave wasn't doing many interviews when he was estranged from the team, I was one of the guys that he would talk to. So that was pretty amazing in itself.
Are we saying then that those feelings are over with now, that there is a forgiveness? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I give Brendan Shanahan. Cliff Fletcher started the repair job, and then John Ferguson Jr. did took it to the next step, and then ultimately Brendan Shanahan and the crew there now have, I think all those fences have been mended, and especially when they it surprised everybody with retiring those numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
That was the closure for everybody there to get them back and into the fold. And Tim Lywicki, who was the president there for a while, he misspoke when he talked about. He didn't want them to forget the past, but he just didn't want them living in the past. Let's create our own history, is what he wanted, and I think Brendan's been able to get that message along to everybody that we're never going to forget that history because it's very important, but let's try and create our own bit of history here.
So we won't give away what is 1 through 100 because that's why we want you to buy the book. It's right in time for
What a
Christmas.
concept.
You're not gonna.
Let's start at number 1.
Give it away. I wonder if are you gonna get any phone calls from guys who've known you over the years and go, seriously, I'm not in the book. you don't remember that goal? You don't remember that time?
Now, those guys don't buy books, so, so I never hear from them. But eventually I'll probably hear from somebody, but you never know.
Well, as I said, it's going to be one of those books that guys are going to read, and then they're going to have arguments over. But regardless of those interactions,
there's no moments that don't belong, but you
Right.
can always
Right.
find
Oh,
other
sure.
moments and other players that you could have said, hey, you could have put that in there.
And good
So,
timing on it. This is the coffee book of the Christmas season, in my opinion, because it's a lot of pictures, good read, gets to the point, finishes the 100, have the debate, and it should be on every single sports fan's coffee table because it's a nice piece of hockey history.
Well, thank you very much.
Russell also is a huge Maple Leaf fan. He probably wants to know, is Austin Matthews being drafted? Is that in the book?
That was 101.
Oh, I just missed out.
Well, as I said, there's so much to talk about. And I also wonder, too, geographically, right? Because if we're here in Toronto, having worked in the West and understanding how it's perceived, I think the people going through that book saying, okay, there's one Toronto. There's another Toronto. Did it ever come across going, geez, maybe I got to, is this geographically biased at any point?
No, I think we've covered all the bases. I don't think it wasn't Toronto-centric by any stretch, but you have to keep in mind that when you go beyond the last 50 years, there was a lot of Toronto moments. Bill Barilko's goal is iconic. Conn Smythe and the building of Maple Leaf Gardens. We did all the original 6 buildings and the stories behind them and things like that. So when you think if there were a 6-team league predominantly over those first 50 years, Toronto was a big part. Toronto and Montreal were pretty predominant in terms of winning Stanley Cups and having those moments.
Of those players, and again, obviously we're not going to give anything away, but, there's certain names that pop into people. You talk about 100 moments. For you, even professionally, Bobby Orr, where does he fit for you? Is he one of the biggest game changers? Is he one of the greatest players of all time?
Oh, absolutely. I think you Bobby Orr, Wayne Gretzky. I think you throw Mario in that conversation. Now Sid. Maybe it's going to be an Austin Matthews. Maybe it's going to be Connor McDavid, the next one that goes into that conversation. I don't think you put them there yet, but they certainly have the potential to get there. But yeah, Bobby Orr changed the game. Wayne Gretzky changed how the game was played. Now, when you think about it, once upon a time, people looked at defensemen and said it was all about defending, not about. Now people look at a defenseman and said, "Geez, he's only got 30 points. What a stiff!"
Exactly, that is true.
You measure them at both ends of the rink, and Bobby just totally redefined how a defenseman played, and maybe carried on a little bit from a Doug Harvey and a few who played prior to him, but certainly took it to a whole nother level with a skill set and ability to. You go back and look some of those videos, he was doing laps around that ice with guys chasing him and just totally controlling the puck and dominating the play. I mean, yeah, just superstar for sure. And I don't like to get into, well, who's better? Was it Orr or
It's
Gretzky?
hard to do.
It's hard to compare.
I don't like the generational comparisons because the
they're
game
just great.
It's great of their time. There's no problem with that. I don't think.
No, absolutely. You don't have to get into he's number 1, he's number 2. They're just great.
Scotty, thanks so much for coming down to the studio today. The last time, a couple times we've seen you, we've been at the OHL, the Steelheads tournament,
That's right,
which has always been a lot of fun. Which we did win one year, by the way. Don't hate. Don't hate.
Yeah, my son was at their camp this year, so that was fun.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Tell us about
fantastic.
that.
Well, he was he's a goalie, and he was invited out to the camp. And as with most of the younger kids, they get their first 3 days there, and then because eligibility is to keep doors open for other things. That unless you're going to crack the lineup or you move on. But a fabulous experience, and
That's great.
They're a great organization.
yeah, they really
are.
are first class. Elliot Kerr and that group are totally great, and JR the coach, and his little memory of it was he came out. I was watching a scrimmage one day, and Owen Tippett, who was
Yes.
drafted
Absolutely.
by Florida,
Yes.
he teed one up in the slot, and Mark somehow got the glove up to catch it. It was like somehow,
Yeah.
And all of a sudden he came out afterwards and he says, "Look at my hand." He said, "I've never had a bruise like this. It was just an absolute laser."
Yeah.
But
That's an NHL shot right there. That's
but
what
a
he stopped.
Great experience, and now he's actually playing. You talk about Sidney Crosby. He's going to Dalhousie, and he's been hurt, but he's playing for the Cole Harbor Colts.
Oh, there you go.
I don't know,
Interesting.
some guy who was pretty good came from Cole
he
Harbor.
was-
okay.
yeah, Wasn't bad, yeah.
Yeah.
Depends on who you
There's
talk.
pictures in the arena
that's right,
somewhere.
yeah.
I think I saw it on the wall. So
Scotty, thanks so much for I said coming
Well,
down
thanks
and
for
talking
having
the
me.
book. The book is Penguin Random House, correct?
You got it. 100 Years, 100 Moments. It's out in all good bookstores,
Klein and Stewart,
Amazon.com.
actually,
Yep.
but they're all part of the same.
Is you know what?
house.
That's what we were talking about. Because
Yeah.
when I talked to Ruda's of course everything Penguin Random House, and then Mike says, "Are you sure?" Because I read this, and it's like so.
I think they're all the
They're all related.
Okay.
Yeah, they are,
okay.
they are.
Good.
My
okay.
editor came over from Penguin Random House.
Yeah.
Because of his hockey background. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just a little different than my book, which was 100 things. What was it called? 100 things that you're all wrong about.
Yeah.
That's a
Right
nice.
about something like
Yeah,
that.
it's a nice title. Friendly.
100-year similarity, though, right? I mean,
One friendly and helpful. The other one, none of those things. We'd like to thank Scotty Morrison for coming down. Are we saying Rogers Sportsnet? That's what we say.
Yeah. NHL on Sportsnet.
Hall of Fame man. Is that how it's said?
we're
I don't
saying
know.
that too. Absolutely,
Not
bro.
being in that category. Maybe one day. Maybe Lanny just call me up and just for fun. Lanny, is that going to kill you? Coming up tomorrow, we got all your picks. We'll have Victor Newman's passionate picks. We also have Phil Gray from Sports Interaction, and Dave Bastel's foreplay, Russell Graham's happy endings, and my sexy picks of gold sex. That's right, Scotty. There's a theme. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for joining us.
see ya.